Here we are in Chapter 7 where we are going to talk about survey research. Survey research is near and dear to my heart because that was the methodologies that I used for my dissertation. So you kind of learn an awful lot about it, and you take several courses in survey administration and creation, and you tend to pick up a lot of tidbits. Survey research has also been something that I've done in my master's program, so it's something that I like to do. I'm well aware of its advantages, its disadvantages, and I recognize that it's not the end-all be-all to doing research, so that's good news too. But it is something that we can do in this class and do a project on without having to go through the effort of finding people to come to one location to do an experiment or whatever. Plus, we can keep things anonymous and private. So survey research is really good for doing student projects because of those reasons mentioned just now. And they're relatively easy to create, and we recognize that that when we create questions, we can use some sound logic and design principles in order to create a decent survey even without having to go through data validation and everything. So it's pretty cool. So let's jump into the objectives for this chapter, and then we will start into the lecture. So some objectives that we're going to go through, we're going to take a look at some reasons for conducting survey research, look at some factors to consider when writing questions for the interviewers or the questionnaires. We're going to take a look at some of the construction issues like responses and closed and open-ended questions and rating scales, etc. We're going to look at a couple different ways to administer surveys, either the written questionnaires or the oral interviews. And then we're going to talk about interviewer bias as well as what a panel study is. We're going to talk about probability versus non-probability sampling techniques and the benefits of each. We'll look at simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling, and we'll use some examples that will make sense to you being a student here at Olivet College. We're going to talk about convenience, or what we sometimes call haphazard sampling, purpose of sampling, and quota sampling. And then we'll look at how samples are evaluated for bias, including sampling, frame, and the response rate. So there's a lot of things that we're going to cover, but I think that this will kind of make sense to you, especially because you've probably seen survey research before, but maybe have not been able to put the technical aspects to play. So let's take a look at why we conduct surveys. When we do surveys, it's really to get to know something about a large group of people. They can be student opinion surveys, which you all have probably done before. They could be exit surveys or exit interviews. They could be kind of a man on the street kind of survey to where you just want to find out what people are thinking, just an everyday person. Lots of surveys, and it's not always a survey in terms of you sit down and answer questions. Sometimes it can be an interview. Just having a conversation with somebody, and they might be guiding some kind of line of question if they're doing a structured format or a semi-structured format where they have some kind of general question that they want to ask, but they're willing to go off on a tangent if that's where you want to go. It just depends on what the researcher is looking to do. Surveys also help us to substantiate the external validity of experimental studies. So let's say we do an experimental study where we want to find out if there is an increase in appetite if people see foods that they find appealing to them. And we had a control group that looked at foods that may not be appealing to them, and we compared those results in terms of how hungry it made them to the people who were looking at foods that really made them hungry. Well, after that study, we could do a quick survey of the individuals to find out if they were hungry already when they were looking at the pictures, because that might make a difference. If they were already thinking about foods that they liked, how hungry they normally get even when they do see the foods that they like. So we could check a lot of information against the data that we found from the experiment by using a survey that would check to see if they were aware or if they were influenced by the manipulation of the independent variable. In this example, the independent variable would be which group they belong to, the control or the experimental group, and even to some extent whether or not they were really excited about the food that they were seeing. So we can take a look and see if the external validity is on par with an experimental study, because we know that experimental studies tend to sacrifice external validity, but when we combine those methods together, we can improve both. And also surveys can help guide policy. A survey could be something like a voting item on during an election on a ballot. So we could have something like, do you agree with this policy? And if more people than not agree with the policy, then the policy will be put into place because more people than not want that thing, whatever the policy is. And it's a simple survey. It's a simple, do you like this or do you not like this? And they check yes or no. And then if enough people say yes, there's the policy. So it's just a simple survey. There are some there are some issues in surveys and interviews, though. A couple of things are called response sets and social desirability. Response sets have to do with how people choose to respond on a survey, and social desirability is when you change your response based on wanting to be seen as positive among your social peers. So what do we ask during a survey? Really, it depends on what you're trying to do with your research. So if you have a research question that is something like, do athletes on campus study as much as non-athletes on campus? Well, you're probably going to have to ask some questions about whether or not the individuals are athletes, maybe what sports they play, how much they study, what kind of classes are they taking, maybe what major they're in. Maybe you would ask a question like, how much did you study in high school? There are lots of different questions that you could ask, but they're going to be about the topic, and they should really only be about the topic itself. Otherwise, you have information that you're asking people, and you're bogging them down with a lot of questions that they may not want to answer. And if you do that, they're less likely to give you good answers to the question that you're most interested in. When you're constructing a survey, there are 3 different kinds of questions that you can ask generally. The first type of question are the facts and demographics. The facts and demographics are what we call participant characteristics. These are things like your age, the grade you are in school, maybe what your major is. You could ask questions like, how far away do you live from campus? If you're interested in maybe the difference between residential versus non-residential students, whatever it is, you could ask those kinds of questions about the individuals. The behaviors are something that the respondents will respond with that measures some kind of amount or frequency or quantity or magnitude of a particular behavior. How many times a week do you eat at the KC could be a behavior question. Something like, do you bite your fingernails when you're anxious could be a behavior type question. Then you have attitudes and beliefs. How do you feel about something? What's your attitude about something? What do you believe about something? So usually we ask these on scales, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you feel that LGBT community on campus can feel comfortable? It's just a very simple question. How much do you feel they can feel comfortable? Some people might be members of the LGBTQ community. Other people might not be who are taking your survey. So you're going to get a lot of different answers. But what you're doing is you're getting a composite of everybody's attitudes and beliefs about a particular topic. So, very basically, the facts and demographics, usually those are some unchangeable characteristics. It's usually a snapshot of who they are at that moment. The behaviors are kind of a self-report. If we're just doing a survey, it's a self-report of the things that they do in terms of the quantity or magnitude. And then attitudes and beliefs is an introspection of how somebody feels, and it's a self-report of their feeling about a particular topic. So one thing to keep in mind, though, about whatever question you're asking is that it is a snapshot of that person's interpretation at that particular moment. We know that our attitudes and beliefs change based on a moment sometimes. We can feel good about Olivet College 1 minute, and then the next minute we're kind of bummed out about it, depending on what's gone on. So we have to recognize that when we're doing survey research, everything is a snapshot of the interpretation of the respondent in that moment. We also need to be careful to word our questions properly. We need to make sure that we are avoiding jargon, imprecise or vague terms, poor grammar, long or overphrased questions, or providing misleading information within questions. Some other things you need to look out for that are not necessarily written out in the textbook are writing questions in common language. That means that you have to avoid slang use. Even if it's something that somebody uses on a regular basis and we're all pretty sure we know what it means, that doesn't mean that that's what we use for the question. One of the things that I have seen in our surveys throughout teaching this course for many years now, somebody has used the term baby daddy. And the question was something like, are you currently with a partner or a baby daddy? That was kind of the question because they were interested in knowing about single motherhood. And obviously that phrase baby daddy is well known, and it's well known as a slang term, but it's important that we're using precise terminology that doesn't rely on jargon or slang. So instead of saying something like baby daddy, you would say, are you with the child's father? Which is the same thing, and hardly anybody's going to get confused by it, but it is still important to use precise language. We also want to keep the question simple. If a question does need to be complex, include some background information. When I think of a question that has to be necessarily complex, I think of like these questions that we see on standardized tests where it says something like, read this paragraph and then answer the questions afterward. That's a reasonable way to do a complex question in a survey. So if you have a complex idea, maybe it's a political idea and you want to know how people feel about it, you would start by setting something up like, in the last 12 years, there have been a mix of Republican and Democratic candidates who have won the election. These several policies have been passed under Democrats. These several policies have been passed under Republicans. And then you go into a couple questions. Which of these is most important to you? Which do you identify with, Republican or Democrat, or neither? We can give them the option. And then you could have another question that says something like, name one policy that you wish could be passed under the current president. What we're doing there is we're taking a lot of complex issues, we're breaking them down by creating this paragraph first, so give some background information, and then we'll ask several questions afterwards about that same paragraph. That way we don't make each question overly complex, but they all refer back to one piece of information that's easily accessible. So keep the questions as simple as you can, and if you have to ask a complex question or a complex set of questions, give a preamble to it and then go into your questions. We also want to avoid some very common pitfalls in writing questions. One of them is a double-barreled question, which is asking two questions in once or that include multiple components. So if you ask a question like, do you think that we should eliminate parking on campus for freshmen and creating different lots for upperclassmen? Okay. If those are all reasonable things to ask, but not at the same time because you've asked two questions at once. One person cannot say yes to one and no to the other because you've created a double-barreled question. Another type of question is a loaded question that suggests that there is a correct answer or it pressures one way of responding. So we could use an emotionally laden term. For example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how immature do you think freshmen are? Okay, so that's a loaded question because it incorporates an idea of immaturity, which can feel off-putting and disparaging to freshmen. Now, is there an immaturity among freshmen? Maybe, maybe not. It just depends on what you mean and how you've defined immaturity. But there's also an immaturity among other people. So asking that question becomes loaded if you don't clarify something. If you ask the question something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much have you noticed that incoming freshmen appear to be physically immature? And we could even go on to define that means people appear to be a little bit smaller, or that there are some secondary sex characteristics that haven't developed yet, like facial hair in the incoming freshmen young men. We could ask a lot of those questions, but if we could also talk about social immaturity, but you'd have to define that in such a way that doesn't have that loaded immature term. So you could ask a question about social immaturity that says something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much have you noticed that incoming freshmen are less able to deal with their emotions? Or that incoming freshmen struggle to make meaningful friendships? Those could be some ways to define immaturity. Now, by the way, this is my disclaimer. I'm not suggesting that this is true of the incoming freshman. I'm just giving an example of how we can charge a term so much that it kind of makes you wonder if there is a disparaging notion about it. And researchers can do this quite frequently if we're not careful about our biases or our stereotypes about groups of people. Another way that we can, another aspect that we need to avoid is the negative wording that inverts the direct meaning of the question. So you would not want to ask a question that says something like, do you agree that not spending money will improve the budget deficit? Okay, do you agree that not spending money will improve the budget deficit? We can untie that and make sense of that sentence if we read it a couple of times, but the reality is that we don't want to take any risk. So we would want to positively word that. Okay, so it'd be something like, do you agree that frugal spending will improve the budget deficit? So do you agree that frugal spending, which is the idea that we are careful about how we're spending money, will improve the budget deficit? It's a very simple change, but you'd be surprised at how often we write as if we're speaking. Almost like when we're typing a sentence, if we say something like, do you agree that not spending money will improve the budget deficit? We don't bother to go back and change the wording because we feel like, well, I've already written the sentence, so it's done. No, you go back and you say that not spending money and turn it into that frugal spending will improve the budget deficit. So try to avoid the negative wording by going back and clarifying the sentence and taking out the not or the negative type wording. Now, another aspect that happens with survey respondents is what's called nay or yay saying. It's agreeing or disagreeing with the researcher as a heuristic rather than honest responding, meaning that people will go through, and if they generally like the kind of topic that the researcher is investigating, then they will answer a certain way. They may not even read the questions. They'll just kind of answer all one way. If they're filling in bubbles, for example, they might kind of bounce between the top 2 or 3 bubbles. Or if they really don't like the researcher or what they're talking about, they might go to the negative side and say, well, gee, that's all awful. Think of a survey that asks you about the KC food. And you know that the outcome of the survey will help to make change in the KC. If they ask a bunch of questions about how do you like the food, the atmosphere, how do you like the options and the choices that are there and the quality of the food, and if you don't really like the KC, you're going to answer negatively for all of those. You might not even read the questions. You just might answer negatively because you don't like the KC and you want there to be some change. But if you do like the KC and you like how things are going, you may not read the question either, and you might just answer them all positively, even if you don't agree with everything. A way that you can check for that is to ask questions that are reverse coded. For example, one question could be, let me set this up a little bit differently. On a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is completely disagree and 5 is completely agree. If you asked, I always enjoy the KC food. Let's say that you did, and you selected 5. Boop, makes sense. And then you ask a question that says something like, sometimes the KC food is not to my liking. If somebody marks that a 5 because they're not paying attention, they're just yay saying, you'll have checked and caught the fact that they're not reading the questions and they're just going through and answering them kind of as a set. So they have a 5 for, I really like the KC food, and also a 5 for, sometimes the KC food is not to my liking. So you would kind of see that they're asking 2 oppositely worded questions, or at least antagonistic questions, the same way. It's a way for us to determine if they're being truthful about the responses. This is also a technique that people who are writing multifaceted inventories will use. They will use oppositely worded questions to make sure that somebody is actually reading the questions. And at the end of a long survey, you might be able to go back and see that, so for questions 5, 7, 9, and 10, they answered all the same way, even though 2 of those questions were oppositely worded. And you can see that maybe the results aren't going to be helpful and you might toss out that particular case. So be careful about nay and yay saying, and you can check for that by looking at the results and recognizing that some people are generally answering the questions incorrectly. So when we write our questions, we want to be careful about the way that we write the questions, but also how we allow people to respond to the questions. So we want to use some closed questions on purpose. So closed questions limit the responses to the given choices. So you've seen closed questions. Those are the survey questions where you click a box, click a button. Maybe it's a quick drop down where you write your where you indicate how old you are. Maybe it's a button that you click on that says, I'm going to score this a 7 out of 10. Whatever it is, you click on it and you're done. And you only have a certain amount of responses that you can possibly answer with because of the way that the researchers have limited the type of responses you can have. Then you have open-ended questions that allow the respondent to enter anything that they want to. Usually those are short text boxes or long text boxes like the paragraph ones, or even the other responses. For the sake of the survey that you're going to be writing for this class, you'll want to avoid the open-ended questions because we're kind of tying it into statistics and it wants to be quantitative, which means that you want to not have to deal with qualitative responses as much as you can handle. Having an occasional qualitative question is fine, but you won't be able to use it much for stats anyways. So if you want to have it just for your own edification, knock yourself out. Data validation is also something that comes into play with with open-ended questions. So in Google, you can ask somebody to type in how old they are, and you can tell Google to only allow typed in responses that are numbers between 18 and let's say 100. And if they try to type in that they are 200 years old, Google will tell them, no, that's not one of the possible choices. Please try again. So we want to be sure that when we're using data validation, that we recognize that even with data validation, people can lie. And people can lie anyways, right? If you have a drop-down menu, they could pick the wrong age. But we want to make it as easy as we can on the individuals who are taking the survey to give us good, meaningful data. So we try to use data validation as much as we possibly can for both closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. For example, with the closed-ended question, we can require that when they type in their answer to what city they live in, that they give us at least 3 characters. And there aren't a lot of city names that are fewer than 3 characters. So what we're doing is we're keeping people from typing in just the letter A and moving on just because they don't want to answer the question. They want to get to the end of the survey. We can require those kinds of things. But remember, somebody can type in whatever they want to, even if they're given a certain amount of characters. Another consideration of how people respond to questions is how many responses do we provide in the closed-ended question. Some questions can be yes or no or true or false, and in those cases, obviously, it's yes or no or true or false. For example, do you play a sport? Yes, no. They just have those 2 choices, not a big deal. You could also have agree versus disagree. So you have, do you agree with the following statement, do you disagree with the following statement? And they select disagree or agree. No big deal. But when you have things like a scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like the KC food? People can choose between anything from 1 to 10 and you're fine. But what about asking it on a 1 to 5? Is there a meaningful difference? You'd be surprised. The number of responses that people can have between 1 and 10 is 10. What that means is that there is not a middle number. People can't choose the dead middle of that. Even if they're in the middle, they have to pick either 5 or 6. They can't pick 5.5. So what you're doing is you're making people select something that's not in the middle. Whereas if you had a scale of 1 to 5 where there are 5 possible choices, somebody could pick a 3 and just kind of float in the middle. And there's a really interesting study out there that takes a look at the difference between people who use 1 through 10 or even numbered scales compared to those who use odd numbered scales. And there is a disproportionate amount of responses that are the dead middle of a 1 to 5 scale as compared to a 1 to 10 scale. The scores are better spread out. People answer more honestly if they must choose a number that's not right in the middle. So when we're thinking about how many responses to give, do yourself a favor and try to avoid neutral responses whenever you can, unless it's reasonable. If you have a question that you're okay with having a neutral response, then go ahead. But generally, if it's just on a number scale, try to avoid a neutral number whenever you can. When we're using rating scales, we want to find out about quantities or intensities. So we can use several different types of rating scales, like a graphic rating scale, semantic differential scale, a nonverbal or a digital analog scale. or response alternatives that label each individual response rather than anchoring. Let's take a look at a few, or one example of each one on the next slide here. Here we're looking at 4 different examples of the scales that we had in the last slide. So the first is a graphic rating scale. So if I ask a question like, how often do you play video games? And I asked you just to put a line where you thought yours might be, you might put a line, let's say here. If you put a line there, what I would end up doing is putting a scale over top of that. So I would physically take a scale and I would lay it over that maybe had percentages like 25%, 50%, 75, and 100%. And I would see where that line fell. And I might say, okay, this person appears to be maybe 25%. They're playing video games 25% of the time, or whatever the scale might be. With the graphic rating scale, we allow the person to just freely put a line there, and we will code what it means later on. It keeps people from using their brain too much to kind of assess how much they might be playing a video game. A semantic differential scale is when we have two terms that mean something different. So you have to choose between the two terms, and maybe you put an X on the line that you feel kind of makes more sense. So there is some overlap between the semantic differential and the graphical rating scale. So you might put an X and just make a choice, and you might number these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you could say that, on average, people find the permissibility of corporal punishment, a 3 on average, or a 7 on average, or whatever the scale might be. The nonverbal digital analog scale is something that we've seen before. It's the Wong-Baker faces scale. And if I asked you what's your pain today, you could either look at the faces and say, well, I feel this one, or you could tell me what number it is. So either way, it allows you to work with people who are nonverbal, or just for people who prefer to have an example of what one of the faces might look like. Then the last is called response alternatives, and you've seen these before too, where we will label the individual responses rather than anchoring. So in these two cases, the top 2 scales, these are both using anchors, meaning that we anchor the first and the last, and you have to choose between them. But in a response alternative, we don't say never and always and have them fill in the blank between. We use the response alternatives so that people understand what they mean. So never, sometimes, often, always. Usually the responses are in antagonistic pairs, so the first response is never, the last one is always. The second response is sometimes, then the third one is often. So these two are paired together. They mean the same thing, but they're opposite. Sometimes is the opposite of often. Never is the opposite of always. So you can see how we use those as a way to allow people to select something that is more meaningful than just having them vaguely choose between 2 anchors. Once we have all of our questions written, we have to think about how we're going to finalize our survey. So we need to think about the formatting. We'd like to have our surveys formatted attractively and professionally so that the people who are taking our surveys take them seriously. You've probably seen these paper surveys where people literally write on them and make photocopies and ask you to take the survey. I've seen students do this, not in my class, but I've seen people do this before, and it doesn't look like it's an authentic survey. It needs to be neatly typed and free from errors, so make sure that you're editing these. And use a consistent point scale format. If you're going to decide to use a scale of 1 to 5 on one question, use a scale of 1 to 5 on your other questions too. Whatever it is, make it consistent. When you're talking about or thinking about what order to put your questions in, put your most interesting questions first. Meaning, don't put the demographic questions first about age, ethnicity, how old you are, or where you are in school, what grade you are in school, and things like that. Put those last, because generally, if people are going to stop taking a survey, It's going to be as they go through it. And if you have people that are taking your survey, you want them to get through the interesting research questions that you have for them. And if they are going to skip something, let it be the demographic questions. They're very important to us. We want to know about the demographics so we can use grouping variables. But if they are going to skip something, let it be the demographic questions so we can get the research questions. When people get tired of taking a survey, it's called test fatigue. Generally, we want people to take a survey and for it to take them less than 7 to 10 minutes and to have fewer than 3 or 4 pages of questions. Generally, if they take a survey that is more than 20 questions or so, you're going to have a lower response rate. If there are questions that are related in content, put them together. If there are questions that are using the same type of scale, put them together. We want to make it so that people don't have to switch back and forth between question types. So if you have 10 questions, they're on a scale of 1 to 5, group them together. We'll talk about this more in class, but Google has some different question types that are really handy. One of my favorite types of questions are the grid questions, where you ask many questions on the same scale and you just use one scale that gets applied to all the questions. It's really handy as opposed to writing one question with one scale, another question with another scale. It seems to be redundant. So it's interesting to use that as a way to save time, and it looks really professional to the people taking your survey as well. We also want to refine our questions. We want to proof our questions with others when we can. And there is a difference between how we proof our questions with individuals. There's an idea called a field test. A field test is where we ask people to look at our surveys and ask questions about the questions. We're not going to have them take the survey. We're not going to use their data. All we're asking them to do is answer questions like, do these questions make sense to you? Do you feel like that some of the questions are double-barreled? Do you feel like the order of the questions makes sense? Again, we're not getting data. We're just asking them if the survey makes sense. And we can do that pretty freely without any need to go through any informed consent or anything, because we're not actually collecting data. We're just getting an opinion of the survey that we've created. Now, a pilot study, on the other hand, is when we have a group of people go through our survey, answer all the questions, and we use their data. And the pilot study is a way to make sure that our data is valid and reliable. We aren't going to go through that process in this class because we don't have enough time, and there's a lot of ethical issues that go into that we'd have to have IRB approval for. So we are not going to do a pilot study, but we can field test. And really what we're going to do is we're going to field test with each other, with the people in your group, with me, and with other people in the class as well. We want to make sure that your questions make some sense. Now that you've finalized your survey, we have to figure out how to get people to take your survey. There are different ways of doing this, and usually what we're talking about when we're talking about survey administration is questionnaires. There is another type of survey called an interview, but generally those are done in person, where we have people sit down and talk about their responses. But the questionnaire, we can administer many ways. Some of them are listed here. We have personal administration to groups or individuals. So maybe you have a group of people come into a large room. They'll all sit down and they'll take your survey at the same time and then leave. It's pretty time consuming and taxing for the researchers. We can also mail the questionnaires out. When we mail out the questionnaires, people can get them. They will take them at their leisure, and then they will mail them back. The response rates for mail surveys is pretty low, like 10%. If you sent out 100 mail surveys, expect to get back 10, maybe 12 if you're lucky. Online surveys have a little bit better response rates. You're able to get online surveys back at a rate that's closer to 20%. So if you sent out 100 people, or if you sent out your survey to 100 people, you're probably going to get back 20 that respond online. One of the best ways to get responses, but also the most expensive, and usually you have to sign up for things, is using panel-based survey administration. What that means is that you can go to places like SurveyMonkey, Amazon's Mechanical Turk, or a company called Qualtrics, and what happens is they have people that are ready to take surveys. People sign up with Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Mechanical Turk, and they take a survey when they sign up. with these companies that get a lot of information about the individuals. And what you would do is you would go to SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or Amazon and say, hey, I'm looking for 100 people who are college residents and who have been in the Greek system for 1 year. And SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, whoever you go to will say, okay, we can get 100 people for you, no problem. It'll cost you $5 per person, but you'll get your response from the people that you're interested in. And you'll get your responses in 3 days. You'll have everything you need and you'll be good to go. It's a little expensive, obviously, but you will get your responses without any questions. And there are a certain number of people that you have to have respond to a survey in order to meet your statistical power and effect size estimates. We're not going to worry about that for this class. We'll take whoever we can get. For my dissertation, I used Qualtrics in order to get signed up with them and to get the 125 respondents that I needed with the 10 criteria that I needed. Cost me just over $1,200. But it took me 3 days from the time I clicked go to the time I got my results back. My peers were taking up to 6 weeks. That cost them an extra semester's worth of tuition at $2,500 a semester. They were too worried about coughing up $1,200 for Qualtrics, but instead they spent twice that on tuition. Sometimes it pays to get the responses that you need. When you look at any of these responses, it's important to keep in mind that none of the methods necessarily guarantees a representative sample of people of interest. Even if you go to Qualtrics and say, I need 125 people that have these 10 criteria, we always know that there are many other characteristics that people have that could become confounding variables. So we need to be careful that we can't just say that, yes, everybody met my inclusion criteria, so that means that this is a representative sample and I can generalize to blah, 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 blah. We really can't generalize to anybody using the survey methodology except for in terms of the people, except for in terms of the characteristics of the people that took our surveys. So be careful about generalization statements about surveys because you really don't have a lot of control about some of the other aspects of the characteristics beyond what people have reported their characteristics are. We talk about questionnaires a lot, but there are interviews that can be a type of survey. Remember, a survey is just about collecting information from individuals. And the questionnaire is one way to get it by asking people questions and responding to it. Interviews can be a really valuable way to get information, especially a qualitative interview where you're asking people to discuss something or an attitude or a belief. So the response rates tend to be higher for interviews. People feel personally accountable to you as the interviewer if they have an interview scheduled. You know, if they don't want to mail back a survey, fine, they're not going to feel bad about it. But if they have an interview scheduled, or if you walk up to somebody and say, hey, may I talk to you? It's harder for them to say no, which kind of also brings into question whether or not the responses that you're getting are genuine and everything. Anyways, the response rates do tend to be higher. What's also nice about the interview is that if the respondent has a question about something, they can ask the interviewer and the interviewer can clarify that right then and there. Whereas if somebody has a question about a questionnaire question, they can't ask anybody. They have to interpret it as the best they can, which may be decent and reasonable, or they can misinterpret the question, or worse yet, they might skip the question because they don't know what it means. What's nice, too, is that the interviewer can ask a follow-up question of the respondent. So if the participant is in the study, the interviewer can ask them a question if they have a follow-up they want to do. A potential problem with interviews is that there is this interview bias, where if somebody responds a particular way to a question and the interviewer doesn't like the response either because it doesn't fit the hypothesis or it's off topic or whatever, the individual who's being interviewed can see that. And they'll respond a certain way. So there's some reactivity in the personal interviews. Interviewers might also have expectations that could lead the respondents. And we can do that unconsciously. Even a good interviewer who's trying to remain unbiased can accidentally ask a question in a way where the person who is answering knows the direction that the interviewer is looking to go. So we have to be careful about interviews, but they can be very, very valuable. The face-to-face interview is where we meet with the individual like it says, face-to-face to talk. We can do telephone interviews that are less effective and more efficient. I said less effective. Less expensive and more efficient. Sometimes we can use computer-assisted interviewing where you'll have an interview and the phone automatic person will say something like, "Hello, on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied were you with the help that you received today?" And you hit a number. You can also do you can do that via the phone and the computer assisted. So you can do the interactive voice response at the same time as the computer assisted if you are doing it on the phone or on the actual computer. It just depends on what kind of interface they're using. So you can do a response using a microphone if you're attached to a computer, or you can talk into your phone, or you can key in your response on the phone, or you can type in your response on the computer. We've gotten really good at developing ways to interface with computers, so we can do the same thing over the phone that we can on the as we can on the computer. Interestingly, my wife just did a job interview a few weeks ago, and it was all done by computer. She had her phone, and they wanted to do a physical interview, so it was a computer on the other side asking her questions, and then my wife would give her response, hit like the number 7 when she was done responding, and then they go on to the next question. But they would be recording her visually too, as opposed to just audio. Very interesting. Another way that we can get information in an interview setting is by using focus groups. A focus group is a group of people that have been set down to answer questions about a particular topic or issue that everybody has an interest in. You see this quite frequently when you are looking at new products that are coming out. So you might have a toy, and maybe there are 10 8-year-olds playing with the toy, and then somebody will ask them questions about the toy. Was the toy fun? Was it easy to use? Did it have any sharp corners? Was it colorful? They'll ask questions about that, and you'll be able to answer them and get good information from the focus group. But the key there is focus. It's all about a particular topic. They tend to be open-ended, and group interaction is possible. So especially if you're talking about a toy, it's important to have group interaction when you're talking about, is a toy a good thing or not, because we want to know how people would play within a community with other people. So a lot of good information comes from the focus group, which is, again, one of those interview styles. The longitudinal survey is another way that we can get information, but it's tracked over time. Remember, longitudinal is a method by which we get information from administration to administration. Think of as if you took a survey when you became a freshman at Olivet College, and then you'll take a survey when you are a senior, when you're graduating. And we will look at the ways that responses change among groups over time. So we can track these changes over time. Maybe it's satisfaction with the area that you live in. Maybe it's attitudes towards the school system or perceived major problems facing the country. We can ask people about these topics and see how they change over time. A very, very common way of doing research. The hard part about it is that sometimes people don't stay in the study. Obviously, if people aren't available for the first and second part of a study, or the first and subsequent parts of a study, then it loses its reliability. We can also do a panel study where the same respondents are studied over time. Think of like a focus group, but done more than one time. So we could use the same respondents studied over time, and what we like to do is study the relationships between 2 or more variables over time. So if we want to ask somebody about their political tendencies, so we ask a bunch of people about their political tendencies in a particular city, then we ask them again in 4 years, we could study the variables that go into the particular political tendencies, but over time. We can look and see how policies have changed the opinions of the people who live in the city. Or maybe the mayor changed during year 2 of the study, and there were some changes in how people felt about it. So we can look at the effect that some variables have on people's attitudes and beliefs over time using a longitudinal study. So briefly, we'll talk about the samples and populations. When we are drawing a sample, when we are finding people who we are asking the questions of, they come from several places. We have a population of interest. Let's say that we want to know how people at Olivet College perceive the Greek system to be. Kind of an interview type style. So we're just going to ask people, how do you feel about the Greek system? We're going to have good opinions, bad opinions, everything in between, just like we would anything else. So our population of interest is the students at Olivet College. Our sampling frame are people who we have reasonable access to. So a sampling frame could be everybody who has a .edu email address. Generally, that's everybody at Olivet College, but for the sake of it, let's say that not everybody does have it, or maybe some incoming freshmen are still using personal emails. They don't use their .edu email address yet. They haven't caught on to it yet. So our sampling frame are the people that we have access to. And our sample would be the people who actually conduct our study with. We administer our survey to our sample. That comes from the sampling frame based on the population of interest. Another example of this might be something like the opinions of people who are incarcerated. Let's say that we wanted to know what their opinion was of the amount of leisure time they have to spend. So if our population of interest is all incarcerated people, but we only had access to, let's say, all the prisons in Michigan, our sampling frame would be the prisoners in Michigan. And our sample would be the handful of people who we'd be allowed to interview or send a survey to, whatever our methodology was. So our sample would be fairly small. It would come from the people that we have access to in Michigan, but it's based on a population of interest, people who are incarcerated. So our sample will be representing all people who are incarcerated. Now, you can probably already imagine that there's going to be probably some error in our sample, meaning that our sample would be small and local so that they wouldn't be able to represent a lot of other people. But that's okay. We're just talking about the notion of population, sampling frame, and sample. I just want to talk briefly about the concept of sample frame and confidence intervals. And this is really all it is. The larger our sample is, the more likely it is to include our entire population's perspective. Okay, think of it this way. If I wanted to know how everybody in a class felt about an exam, and I had 2 people to ask, there are going to be 18 other people whose opinion I didn't get. And that means that there are 18 people that could change the amount of information that I got. Now, if I had 19 people out of the 20 and I got some feedback on an exam that I gave, I'm probably going to be very confident that there's not a whole lot of error because the last person is not likely to change the overall feeling on the exam for the entire class. If I had everybody in the entire class, there would be no difference between my sample and my population. It would just be everybody in the class. So I wouldn't have any error between my sample and my population. The confidence interval is how likely we are to have the true answer based on our sample. Okay, so if my sample is 19 out of 20 people, so if there are 20 people in the class and my sample is 19, I'm going to be very confident that the true feelings of the class of this exam are represented by those 19 people. If I only had 2, I wouldn't be very confident at all that that the answers that I got represent the entire class. So the basic idea here is the larger the sample that we have, the better we're going to be at determining how likely we are to have the true feelings of the population. Now we're going to wrap up by talking about some sampling techniques. It's important that we pay attention to these because they are important in how we get the information that's important to us. So we're going to talk about these and we're going to go over them more in class with some activities. So we just want to be familiar with them here. The first set of techniques that we're going to talk about are what are called probability sampling. In probability sampling, we need to know the total amount of people in our sampling frame. We can't just send it out to everybody and find out who comes back. That's not a probability sampling technique. Let's say that we needed there to be 50 people in our sample. We wanted to have 50 people. That means that we need to know who are the total amount of people in our sample. And in order for it to be random, we need to randomly select a number of people from that particular sample. So the interesting thing about simple random sampling is that every member of the population, or every member in our sampling frame, has an equal probability of being selected. Let's think about that for a second. When you're in gym class and you want to be counted off into teams, team 1, team 2, team 1, team 2, and you and your buddy want to be on the same team, you will get one person between you. That way you get the same number. In that particular case, everybody does not have an equal chance of being in either of the two groups. What that means is that every other person is going to be in the same group. So there's not an equal chance that the person next to you is going to be in the same group as you. As a matter of fact, by that method, there is no chance. So simple random sampling means that we get everybody in a group and we randomly assign them 1 or 2, and they're in that group. Now, we're going to take a look at a random number generator as a way to sort this out, and we'll put another example to it. But think about simple random sampling as just simply selecting some people at random with no real method to it except for just randomly sampling them. So we're not counting off or anything, it's just random. Now, stratified random sampling is when we're interested in taking a certain amount of people from a particular grouping of a variable. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say that I wanted to select 50 freshmen, 50 sophomores, 50 juniors, and 50 seniors from Olivet College to have them participate in a study. The first thing I would do is I would find out who all the freshmen are, who all the sophomores are, who all the juniors are, and who all the seniors are. And then I would randomly select 50 of the freshmen, 50 sophomores, 50 juniors, 50 seniors. And that would give me 50 from each class. This is different from simple random sampling because if I just did a simple random sample of 200 people at Olivet College, I could possibly get all seniors, and I wouldn't have any freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors. So when I am concerned about getting a sample of people at certain strata or certain levels of a group, I need to find out what those strata are and then sample from each of those strata to get what I want. Another way that we can use probability sampling is through what we call cluster sampling. So cluster sampling could be something like taking each residential block in the city of Olivet and randomly selecting 2 households from it. What we could also do is I could say something like, well, I want to know what the opinions are of how Greek members are being treated on campus. And let's say I wanted to study 50 Greek members who are on campus. I could take a list of all the Greek members and randomly select 50 people. But there is a chance that one of the Greek houses is not represented. So what I could then do is I could use a cluster sample. I could find out what all the clusters are, all the individual houses, and I could select I could select 2 members of each house and have them come together and represent each house and talk about how they're treated on campus. That way I would get a full representation of all the Greek houses that are on campus. There's a small but meaningful difference between stratified random sampling and cluster sampling. Stratified random sampling has to do with strata in terms of the way that groups are naturally divided. Cluster sampling has to do with how organizationally sound a particular variable is. So there is not necessarily a strata in terms of a natural way to sort Greek houses. People choose Greek houses to go into, so they organize themselves. So it's not like we can say that the people who are in a particular Greek house have these characteristics that are shared only among that Greek house. There's not really a there's not really a strata there. It's a cluster. People come together for a particular reason. Now, let's take a look at a random number generator to see how I might take 50 people from Olivet College. So let's say that I have a very simple research question, and then I want to ask of 50 people. I want to ask them, how do you like the KC food? I want to sample 50 random people from Olivet College. So I have my random number generator, and my random number generator allows me to put in some parameters. So let's say that I want to take one group of 50 people. So how many sets do I want to generate? 1. How many numbers per set? Well, I want 50 people out of my set of numbers. Now what I do is I say, let's just say that there are 1,000 people on campus, and I've listed everybody and numbered them 1 through 1,000. I say that I want to take 50 numbers from 1 to 1,000. So it's going to randomly select 50 numbers from 1,000 people. And it says, do I wish each number in the set to remain unique? Yes. I don't want to pick the same person twice. Do I want to sort the numbers? Yeah, let's sort them least to greatest. That saves me some time having to go through my list up and down a bunch of times. And the place markers, we're not going to worry about that. I randomize it by clicking the button, and my results are listed here. Here are my results. If I had 1,000 people at Olivet College and I each assigned them a number, I would select these 50 numbers, and that's who I would use in my random sample. It's a way for me to not have to worry about, sorting through and saying, well, I'm going to start at the number 21 and count by 33 and then I'm going to select the 33rd number after that and the 33rd number after that. I'm not going to do that because that's not a good way to get a random sample, because if I just selected every certain numbered person, I would be automatically eliminating the possibility for everybody between those two numbers to be selected. And that would be a non-probability sample. So here are my 50 people. I would find out who these 50 people were and have them participate in my study. A very simple way to use a random number generator. And this is just from randomizer.org. You can find many different random number generators. Excel can even give you a random number. It's called the RAND function, R-A-N-D. And then he's type in a parenthesis, and then it'll say, okay, well, how many numbers do you want and between what numbers? And it'll spit them out for you. Lots of different ways to get random number generators. I like to show you websites because they're fun. Now, we have probability sampling, but there's also non-probability sampling, where we don't know the likelihood of getting somebody, or we're just going to take people who have a particular characteristic. So non-probability sampling, the very first type is called a convenience sample. Sometimes we call it haphazard or take them where you find them sampling. So imagine standing outside of the KC to ask people how they feel about department seminar. That's just a convenience sample. It's people who are at the KC, you happen to pick them and you're good to go. You're not picking them because they're at the KC or because you're interested in the people that go to the KC. That just happens to be where a lot of people go and you know what time they're going to be there. A purposive sample is some type of predetermined criterion. So if I want to know how Greeks feel on campus, I'm going to go and seek out people who are Greeks, and just whoever responds, I'm going to take their responses. I'm not going to, sort them. I'm not going to do a random sample. I'm just going to get whoever will respond to me who's a Greek to respond. And the last is quota sampling. So quota sampling is when I want to get some kind of response from a group of people, but I need to get a certain amount in a group of people. So let's say that I wanted to get a proportion of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors to respond to my survey. But I know that there are, maybe 40% freshmen on campus, 30% sophomores, let's say, that doesn't leave very much, 15% juniors, 15% seniors. That's obviously not Olivet College, but let's just say that's what the breakdown is. What I would do is I would receive any responses I got on my surveys up to a proportion where I had 40% freshmen, 30% sophomores, 15% juniors, and 15% seniors. And then I would stop accepting responses after I got the proportions that I needed. So the quota sampling is about finding the correct proportions in my sampling frame in my actual sample. So I want to have a representation of the numbers of people that meet the groups that I'm interested in. Again, we're going to talk more about this in class. The book provides a breakdown of the sampling techniques and some examples of it. Feel free to read through that at your leisure. There's another slide if you'd like to pause and take a look at that. And we're going to end with this. When we think of our samples, we need to evaluate them to make sure that our samples are meaningful to us. So remember, the sample frame is the actual group of people that we have access to when developing a sample, and it's more specific than a population. So when you're thinking of evaluating your samples, make sure that your samples meet the criteria that you're interested in so that you can make some generalization, if you can, to the population. And also another aspect to be mindful of is your response rate. Try to get a good response rate if you can. Sometimes 10% response rate can be good. And remember that there is no good response rate. It's about getting the number of people that will satisfy your statistical analysis. It's not about finding a proportion of the actual population. It's about getting the people to respond in a way that satisfies the people that you need for statistical power. So, there was a lot there. Here we're almost an hour now. Good gravy. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. This is a good chapter for you to really dig into because we are going to be using this methodology for conducting your surveys for this class. So I look forward to seeing what you can do with this. And again, feel free to reach out with questions and go through the book and the presentation to pick up on what you may have missed.